Now let's talk about the election in the United States. If Trump gets another 4 years in the White House, will anything be different? Especially, in terms of his relationship with China, his approach to China.
To some extent, it's difficult to answer that because Trump is so crazy that I just don't know what he's going to do. But just if we say he's going to continue on as he is now, and if we restrict the question just to the question of U.S.-China relations, then I think what's going to happen is that other countries in Asia will not really cooperate with the United States in trying to influence China, so whether it's Japan, Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, and all those countries, Australia, when they look at the United States coming along and saying, let's, you guys should not really tilt over to China, that they're not going to trust us. So they're going to have to decide how to protect their own interests. And some of them, let's say Japan, might decide that, they really cannot count on the United States. So they're going to have to develop, not within 4 years or 6 years, but they're going to have to move in the direction of thinking about developing their own nuclear weapons. So too with South Korea, because North Korea has them. And a country like Malaysia or Thailand or probably has to think about tilting to China, cooperating more with China and less with the United States. And a country like India probably has to really try to invest more in its Navy and its aircraft carriers and to compete directly with China but their strategy would probably be not to pick a fight with China, but to sort of respond to the Chinese buildup with their own buildup, which is very difficult for India because of the way their political system works. I mean, it'll be a more chaotic world with less American influence, and China's opportunity to influence other countries, like we see, for example, with these Western Pacific island nations. That's just a small example. But China, a lot of space will open up for China to exert more influence, because basically Trump makes the United States weak. He's weak. He ruins the alliance system. He ruins the world trading system that the United States used to benefit from. And China will gain, relatively speaking, as the United States continues to be weaker.
I see. So, speaking of Chinese influence, there are two immediate examples that come to mind, right? One is Hong Kong and the other one is Taiwan. So, in Congress, we see that, there's sort of bipartisan strong support for Hong Kong and Taiwan democracy. But the one thing that always haunts me is, if it comes to the White House, and if Trump is the person who's going to make a decision, will he support Hong Kong and Taiwan?
Hong Kong is not important to him, and Taiwan is not intrinsically important to Trump. His friendship with Xi Jinping is not really important to Trump either. Nothing is important. But if the that bill is kind of a fake thing anyway.
You think it's symbolic? It doesn't really sort of...
Symbolic. So the bill says that the administration should, well, first of all, the United States can do nothing really to help the Hong Kong demonstrators. Right? It's not willing, it's not able, and it's not willing. I mean, there's nothing it can really do except symbolically. The bill says that, we're watching you. And it says that if you don't behave nicely, we can cancel some privileges, which would hurt Hong Kong, wouldn't hurt China. I mean, it hurts China a little bit, but it basically hurts Hong Kong. But the administration won't want to cancel these trade privileges and so forth. So it's supposed to file a report with the Congress saying that, are human rights being abused in Hong Kong? And if they are being abused in Hong Kong, then do we have a national security reason why we don't want to cancel Hong Kong's trading privileges? And so this model has been followed so often before. So, for example, back in the 1990s, after Tiananmen, the administration had to file a report with Congress every year saying, is China respecting human rights or not? And if it isn't, we're supposed to cancel their trade tariff privileges, but is there a national security reason for continuing their trade privileges anyway? So, it's a common model in American legislation. And the administration always just files a report and says we're going to continue the trade relationship as it was before due to national security interests. So nothing's going to happen, in other words. Mm-hmm. Symbolic.
I see.
Will Trump sign it? He probably will. Mm-hmm. Because vetoing it would be a sort of politically ugly looking thing to do.
I see.
So it's easier to sign it if it gets passed.
I see. So it's interesting that you draw the analogy between Hong Kong and Tiananmen. But I think we have this sense that it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, for Xi Jinping to deploy the PLA to Hong Kong and stage a Tiananmen 2.0. But, there are remaining questions that need to be answered, right? So how will this all end? Will the protests just fizzle out? What will happen to Carrie Lam? And will Beijing concede to some, if not all, of the protesters' demands? So I'm just curious about your takes on those things.
I guess, I don't know for sure, I don't have a strong confidence in my prediction, but I guess that the protests will fizzle out, that Carrie Lam will be replaced, that Beijing will not make any concessions, mm-hmm. that people in Hong Kong will then be very angry and very sullen and divided as well among themselves. And it's going to be really an unhappy situation with the potential for demonstrations to break out again at any time in the future. Hong Kong people are very, very alienated from mainland China. Mm-hmm. But I think but I do think this round of demonstrations will peter out. I guess the Hong Kong government will arrest violent protesters and try some of them and reestablish control.
Great. So speaking of Carrie Lam, as we saw in that Financial Times piece, Beijing is actually devising a plan to replace her. If there's another chief executive who's presumably handpicked by Beijing as well, but who's not Carrie Lam, who started all this mess, do you think that's going to be sufficient to appease the protesters, at least to some extent?
I don't think so. They don't have to really appease the protesters or gain some kind of authentic support from the Hong Kong population. I think Beijing would need to find a leader who would have some degree of independence, and they don't want to do that. I'm not aware of any sort of candidate who has that quality, who could come up and say, look, somebody with some populist political sense, not the kind of technocrat elite that Beijing likes, but somebody who comes along and says, I hear you, I understand you, let's be honest, we don't have that much leeway, but I'm going to do everything I can to represent the interests of the Hong Kong people vis-a-vis Beijing. I don't see them picking that kind of person. I don't know who that would even be.
I see, but if you look at the protesters' demands, there are 5 of them, right? So having an authentic election is a leading one. Having an independent inquiry or investigation into police conduct, That's another important one. But in general, there are a spectrum of options for Beijing. Do you think it will be possible for Beijing to concede to some of the demands, but not all of them? In other words, do you think it's possible for the protesters and Beijing to meet each other halfway, so to speak?
My sense is that Beijing believes that the root of the problem is really economic.
Mm-hmm.
So that because they are Marxists and they are historical materialists. So I think that the concessions they might offer would instead be on the economic side, not the ones that the protesters have demanded.
Mm-hmm.
If they put in a new leader and the new leader says, I understand about the price of housing and about salaries, and so we're going to work on the economic dimension, which could actually help a new leader to some extent to get some degree of popularity. But
Gotcha.
The investigation of the police, I think, I don't know. Again, I don't have any confidence in my own prediction, but I think for Beijing, the precedent on Chinese territory of investigating the police. Can you do that in Shanghai? Can you do that in Henan?
Gotcha.
I think it's not a nice idea from the point of view of Beijing.
I see. So your sense is that if they start this in Hong Kong, then people elsewhere are going to be taking cues, and they will potentially do the same in other parts of China, and that's potentially dangerous to the communist regime.
Yeah.